Hello, everyone. Unfortunately, I'm going to start off talking about a very troubling topic, which is the rising conservative, fundamentalist, and anti-rights movements. They're all united in their attacks against women, girls, bisexual, lesbian, trans, queer, and intersex communities, as well as human rights defenders and others, because of this vision of what a family, of what an identity, and what a society should be, and that we simply don't conform to that identity. The LGBTQI and women's rights movements intersect and are united by the experience of this retrogressive attacks, laws, policies, and these practices that are all rooted in patriarchy and the control of sexuality. To truly achieve gender equity and equality, all people must be able to make choices about their lives and their bodies, and that's regardless of their sexual orientation, their gender identity, their gender expression, their sexual characteristics. And we must all be able to live free of stigma, violence, and discrimination. Together, there is an urgent need for us to unite as funders and others to dramatically ramp up support for grassroots-led, gender transformative, and root cause approaches to realizing gender equality, both within and across LGBTQI and women's rights movements. AJWS, American Jewish World Service, is a feminist funder that supports organizations, networks, social movements in support of this work in 19 countries around the world. We are a proud member of the Global Philanthropy Project, which is a collaboration of 19 of the leading philanthropic funders around the world focused on global grant making in the global South and East. Our collaboration comprises nearly about 40% of the global grant-making dollars going to LGBTI rights. And together, we are calling upon funders and others to take action in very concrete ways. The first, support. Increase your support for lesbian, bisexual, queer, trans, and intersex issues. 2, fund at the intersection of women's rights and LGBTQI liberation movements. 3, resource the self-determined. Self-determined, you decide what you need. What are your priorities that the LGBTI movements identify for themselves? 4, we need to fund regions, sub-regions, and countries that are simply receiving little to no dollars. And finally, least but not least, commit to do no harm. Why? Why is this important? Well, according to the Global Resources Report, in 2015 and 2016, only 3% of global LGBTI funding outside of the United States was specifically dedicated to LBQ women, lesbian, bisexual, and queer. Trans, 11%. Intersex, less than 1%. In addition, when you look at the funding that's happening, more than 75% of intersex organizations and more than half of trans organizations are operating on a budget of less than, guesses? $10,000 a year. Addressing these historic funding inequities is critical for inclusion and addressing rights violations. Secondly, when we're funding at the intersection of LGBTQI and women's rights movements, this is really critical. It's also about building inclusive movements to combat rising anti-gender and anti-rights agendas. Our power is in our collective voice. For example, let me just give you one example. While many trans and intersex groups around the world engage in feminist organizing, only 9% of trans groups and 18% of intersex groups received any women's rights funding, despite working at these intersections and being critical members of feminist women's rights movements, as well as LGBTQI movements. When I talk about resourcing what people want, how they want it, where they want it, how they need it, I'm really talking about ensuring that they play the lead role, that their participation is inclusive both in the development and implementation of funding priorities. And when I talk about less funding in certain areas, let me just give you a couple of facts and figures to give you a sense of where the dollars are and where they aren't. So for every $100 in international assistance and funding, who wants to guess how many cents go to LGBTI rights? 4 cents. 4 cents. In addition, when you then look at within that category of 4 cents and where those cents are going, in West Africa, for example, 6 million was awarded in West Africa, of which 40% of that 6 million was in one country. When we talk about 13 million, which is absolutely an insufficient dollar for Eastern and Southern Africa, you see that discrepancy really at the regional level, which is critical. Last but not least, we must do no harm. And when I talk about doing no harm, I'm talking about we need to be providing flexible and long-term support, ensuring privacy and confidentiality, particularly in high-risk environments. We're talking about don't give money to intermediaries who have no history or understanding about LGBTI movements, about LGBTI rights. There are locally based intermediaries. There are intermediaries that have expansive experience in working with these communities in very respectful feminist ways. So with that, I just want to leave you with one thought, and this is on behalf of the GPP. Work with us. Come with us together. We can work to achieve gender equity, gender equality, resource equity, and ensure that the power of our collective voice is truly utilized to ensure no discrimination, no violence, no stigma, and gender equity and equality for all people, regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity, sexual expression, and sex characteristics. Thank you so much, and have a good day. Oh.
I'm here. Thank you, Jennifer. I had a question that I think is pertinent to all the organizations, many of whom here who are working in a variety of different countries with different cultural norms trying to affect change. What do you do to, because clearly not one size fits all, how do you deal with cultural norms and develop programming which will be relevant, which will do no harm in those countries?
Right.
What's your approach?
Well, if you want to be relevant and you want to do no harm, you should be stepping back and listening to what communities want, what grassroots-led change looks like. They know how to address the avenues and the cultural sensitivities better than anyone else in the world. There is no one-step solution. It really is about stepping back and prioritizing and privileging the voices of those who are intended to be leading this work.
Okay, and do you often have to deal also with governments and policymakers in order to affect that change from your organization, or do you empower people within the country to affect the change?
Both. We have an office in Washington, D.C., where we're currently focused on trying to combat rising extremism, fundamentalism, anti-gender, anti-rights ideology. As you know, in the United States right now, pretty much every floor of the building's on fire when it comes to rights and anti-gender rhetoric, and so we really work to try to create a more enabling environment for our partners' work. But fundamentally, we believe in grassroots movement-led change, and so we like to step back on the international and at the local level and let our partners drive the change they're seeking in their own community.
Okay, and here's the big question. How will you use your power going forward after this conference?
I think I'm going to step up when I need to, step back when I need to, protest, resist, and act up at every moment possible in support of human rights.
Bravo. Thank you very much.
Thank you.